Harsh circumstances may plant pain, but they do not create a monster. Only a person's choices do. And society must protect its children from deceptive smiles before the darkness swallows them. Welcome to English Crime Files. Step into the archives as we uncover another gripping case from the dark side of history. The Casablanca Monster. Casablanca, 1973. The White City wears two faces. By day, the Atlantic light bleaches the Medina walls and the old colonial boulevards until they glow like bone. By night, the alleys of Derb Sultan and Sidi Masood draw shut like a fist. Salt, diesel, and charcoal hang in the air. Somewhere in that maze, a small girl walks home from school, her satchel bouncing at her hip. Two thin gold bracelets circle her wrist, her grandmother's, worn every day without fail. A man steps from a doorway. Not tall, not threatening. A clean shirt and a smile built for disarming children. Salam, what is your name? He asks where she studies. He falls in a step beside her. Not too close, close enough, talking like a family friend, someone who knows her parents. The girl relaxes. That's the moment he's been waiting for. Still smiling, he takes her hand, gestures toward a shop window, and in one motion, his other hand clamps her wrist. The bracelets are gone before she can scream. He melts into the crowd. The girl is left alone in the fading light, her wrist burning, her pulse hammering. That was the first documented sighting of a predator this city would come to call the smiling killer. We will not use his real identity here. In this file, he is Mustafa El-Mastari, born 1938, in one of Casablanca's poorest working-class quarters, in the years when the city was still finding its modern shape. The Medina back then was a warren of packed courtyards and communal taps, of families stacked 3 and 4 to a room, of children who learned the value of a coin before they learned to read. His childhood offered no tenderness. Hunger, cold, the constant noise of a crowded house. A father remembered, if he was remembered at all, as a shadow that came and went. There was no single incident that broke him, no clean origin story the case files could point to. There was only accumulation, years of going without, years of watching adults fail to protect him, until the boy who might have grown into anything hardened instead around one lesson. The world does not give, so he decided he would take. He did not see himself as violent. He saw himself as clever, and for years the distinction held. He studied the streets the way a predator studies a watering hole, learning their rhythms. When the schoolyards emptied, when the shopkeepers dozed behind their counters, which alleys funneled foot traffic, and which swallowed it whole. And he chose his prey with a precision that unsettled the detectives who later reconstructed his methods. Children, not from hatred. Investigators would stress this point for years afterward, but from calculation. A child's wrist is thin enough to slip a bracelet free without a struggle. A child's trust is cheap, bought with a sweet or kind word. A child's jewelry, gifted by grandmothers and aunts for baptisms and circumcisions, is real gold, sold that same evening for real cash. He built a method and refined it like a tradesman perfecting a craft. He would loiter near schools and shop fronts at the hours he'd mapped out, present himself as harmless, an uncle, a neighbor, a friend of the family, offer a sweet, a kind word, sometimes a few coins for an errand. He would walk with the child, ask about their day, their teachers, their favorite games, building the kind of easy rapport that made a wary parent's warnings feel suddenly irrelevant. And only once the child had fully relaxed, once the last flicker of caution had gone out of their eyes, would he strike, a bracelet torn free, a watch ripped from a wrist, a chain snapped from a throat, the whole exchange over in less time than it takes to describe it. Then he vanished down whichever alley swallowed sound best, already 3 turns away before the child had finished registering what had happened. Police records later credited him with more than 400 such thefts before his first serious arrest, a number that, even accounting for exaggeration and folded-in copycats, paints the portrait of a young man who had turned predation into routine. He was finally caught, convicted, and sentenced to 3 years in prison, a modest sentence for a modest-seeming crime. No one in that courtroom could have imagined what those 3 years would incubate. Prison did not reform him. It sharpened him. Morocco's provincial jails in that era offered little in the way of rehabilitation and a great deal in the way of education. Informal, brutal, and thorough. He walked out with no trade, no family waiting at the gate, nothing but the one skill he'd ever mastered, now honed sharper by years spent among men for whom violence was simply another currency. So he returned to what he knew, but this time he left Casablanca behind, a decision that would cost the authorities dearly in the years to come, scattering his trail across jurisdictional lines that provincial police forces, in that period, rarely thought to cross-reference. North to Kenitra, east to Rabat, deeper still, into the interior towns of Meknes and Fez, each city offering a fresh population of strangers who had never heard his name and a fresh police force with no file on him at all. He became a ghost in the truest sense, not invisible, but simply never in the same jurisdiction long enough for anyone to build a complete picture of him. A partnership forms. In Meknes, Mustafa crossed paths with another young criminal. In this file, Bouche Bezouzi, born 1951 on the outskirts of Casablanca, 13 years Mustafa's junior, already wanted in 3 separate districts for dozens of thefts. Bouche was everything Mustafa was not. Reckless where his new acquaintance was patient, impulsive where the other was calculating, quick to violence where Mustafa still preferred the quieter cruelty of the Khan. They met in a smoke-choked back room in the old Medina, the kind of place where men who could not be seen elsewhere came to drink, to trade information, to disappear for an hour. 2 strangers, and yet the recognition was instant. The particular way stray dogs size each other up before deciding whether to fight or to hunt together. Mustafa noticed money on the younger man, too much of it, folded loosely, spent without counting, and asked where it came from. Bouche only smiled and said nothing. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but it unsettled Mustafa more than a confession would have. He was used to being the one who read people, the one who held the information. Here was a boy younger and rougher than himself who had just demonstrated the same instinct. Reveal nothing. Let silence do the intimidating. Mustafa understood, sitting in that smoke-thick room, that petty theft had a ceiling he was about to hit. Gold bracelets and snatched watches would only ever buy him a life spent looking over his shoulder in provincial towns. to climb past that ceiling, to become something the police couldn't simply arrest and release in 3 years. He needed more than a warm voice and a quick hand. He needed a weapon that made people afraid of him rather than merely annoyed by him. So he built a plan, and it was not impulsive. It was cold, sequential, thought through with the same patience he'd once used to memorize his schoolyard's rhythms. He walked the market until he found a hardware stall selling scrap metal and tools, and there he bought a length of iron pipe, heavy enough to end a fight in one blow, ordinary enough that no one would look twice at a man carrying it home. He hid it beneath his coat and waited for the right night. Cold enough to keep witnesses indoors, foggy enough to blur silhouettes, quiet enough that a single sound would carry and be gone before anyone placed it. The night came. A thin fog rolled low through the empty streets of Meknes, thick enough to swallow the glow of the one working street lamp at the intersection he'd scouted. A member of the auxiliary forces stood there on duty, pistol holstered at his belt, shifting his weight against the cold, thinking, Mustafa would later say, almost admiringly, of home, of dinner, of anything but the man closing the distance behind him. There was no warning, no exchange of words, no hesitation, only the heavy, wet impact of iron against bone. Once, and the officer went down before he understood what had happened to him. Mustafa crouched over the body, unhooked the holster with hands that did not shake, and took the pistol. Then he stood and walked and let the fog close behind him like a door. The petty thief died on that street corner, in every sense but the biological one. What walked away into the Meknes fog was something else entirely. A man now armed, a conscience gone flat and unreflective, and a hunger that stolen gold had never fully satisfied and never would again. Return to the White City. Mustafa came back to Casablanca not as a son returning home, but as a wolf slipping into a den it already knew. Every blind corner, every collapsed wall, every gap in a fence that a grown man could still fold himself through. He arrived by night, on one of the long buses that connected the interior to the coast, stepping down near a row of dim warehouses where stray dogs slept curled against the cold. He pulled his coat tighter and disappeared into streets he had memorized as a boy, streets that hadn't changed nearly as much as he had. His sister lived in Sidi Masoud, in a quarter where the houses leaned into each other like tired old men sharing a secret. She opened the door to find her brother standing in the dark, and she asked him nothing, not where he'd been these past years, not why there was a pistol wrapped in cloth at the bottom of his bag, not why his eyes had a stillness to them that hadn't been there before he left. She simply let him in, fed him, and gave him a mattress in the back room. To the neighborhood, he was just another relative visiting from the north, the kind of unremarkable arrival that draws no questions in a quarter where half the households have someone coming or going. Behind her shutters, in that small back room, a monster was sharpening its claws in plain sight of everyone who never thought to look. For the first weeks, Mustafa lived like something nocturnal. By day, he stayed inside, hidden behind cracked shutters, listening to the ordinary music of the street. Children shouting over a football match, neighbors arguing about rent, the call to prayer rolling out over the rooftops 5 times before sundown. He knew the police in other cities were looking for a man matching his description, but Casablanca was his home ground, and home ground meant advantage. He knew which alleys dead-ended and which opened onto 3 different escape routes, which walls had gaps a grown man could still slip through, which corners the evening patrol never bothered to check. By night, he moved, and he returned first to what he still privately called his first profession, the theft of gold from unsuspecting children. But something in the shape of it had shifted. It was no longer only about the bracelets and the watches. He had tasted something darker in the fog outside Meknes, standing over a man he'd just killed with his own hands. And that taste had settled into him and refused to leave. Each theft now carried an undercurrent that hadn't been there before. Less an act of survival, more a private test of what he could get away with, and how far. Then, one evening near a cafe in Derb Sultan, he felt a stare that wasn't the passing glance of a stranger. It had weight, recognition, the particular quality of being watched by someone who already knew exactly who you were. Across the narrow street, leaning in a shuttered doorway, stood a face he hadn't seen since that smoke-filled room in Meknes. Boucheb Azouzi, thinner now, his features sharpened by whatever the intervening years had put him through, but carrying the same reckless hunger in the set of his shoulders. Meknes got too hot, he said, by way of greeting, as if no time at all had passed. I heard Casablanca was good for business. They crossed to meet each other and walked into the night together, 2 shadows folding into one, and neither of them, in that moment, fully aware of what that merger was about to become. That night, in a disused garage Mustafa sometimes used when he preferred not to trouble his sister's household, the 2 men sat on overturned crates and passed a bottle of cheap wine between them. Boucheb talked first. Dozens of robberies since Meknes, 2 arrests, 2 escapes bought or fought his way out of. Mustafa listened, and when it was his turn, he told Boucheb about the officer, the pipe, the pistol, the fog, how simply it had all gone once he'd committed to it. Boucheb's eyes widened, then narrowed with something that looked almost like respect. You killed a uniform? He asked. Mustafa nodded slowly, letting the silence do some of the talking. I took his weapon. Now I can take whatever I want. Somewhere outside, a cat cried once in the dark, and the sound seemed to settle something between them. Boucheb smiled, the first real smile of the night. What are we waiting for? From that night forward, they were partners. Not friends in any sense either man would have recognized. Not brothers despite the language the police files would later use to describe their bond. But 2 men whose separate, overlapping appetites for cruelty were about to combine into something the city of Casablanca had no name for yet, and would spend the rest of the decade learning to fear. The first killing, late in 1973, near the Mamusnia cinema, the 2 men noticed a 14-year-old boy waiting alone for a friend who never arrived. Mustafa approached with his practiced warmth, claimed friendship with the boy's father, and invited him to a film at a better cinema. The boy hesitated, glanced at Boucheb, and, reassured by nothing more than 2 calm faces, agreed. They never went to any cinema. They led him away from the lights and the crowd, into the dark spaces at the edge of the old Medina, and there, in an abandoned lot littered with broken glass, they murdered him. What the court records describe from this point does not need to be repeated here in detail. It is enough to say, the boy fought, and he could not win. Both men are responsible for what was done to him before his death. They hid his body beneath old planks and refused, and walked away into a city that had no idea evil had just moved into its streets. Weeks passed before a stray dog, digging through trash, found what was left of him. By then, Mustafa and Bouchabe were already planning again. For Mustafa, that first killing was a door that would not close behind him. He felt no guilt in its wake, only a cold, quiet satisfaction, like a man discovering a talent he hadn't known he had. A city begins to whisper. By the close of 1974, Casablanca's poorer quarters were losing their children, one at a time, in a pattern no single desk at police headquarters was positioned to see. Missing persons posters yellowed on lampposts faster than new ones could replace them, each one a photograph, a name, a mother's phone number scrawled at the bottom in handwriting that grew shakier with each passing week. Police files opened, stalled for lack of witnesses, and closed. Routine procedure in an era before centralized records, before any real mechanism existed for a detective in Derb Sultan to compare notes with one in Sidi Masood. The city was vast, its administrative divisions vaster still in practice, and the two men moved through the gaps between them like something airborne, never in one place long enough to be pinned down, never repeating a method precisely enough to form an obvious pattern on paper. What the case files would later make clear, and what no single officer could have pieced together at the time, is how methodical the hunting had become. This was no longer opportunistic theft escalating into violence. Mustafa now sought out a specific kind of vulnerability. Children whose disappearance would draw the least institutional urgency. The poor, the unsupervised, those already treated by circumstances easy to overlook. It was a calculation as cold as anything he'd done with the iron pipe in Meknes, and it very nearly worked exactly as he intended. One winter afternoon, in a Derb Sultan cafe, nursing tea he had no real interest in drinking, Mustafa watched a thin 15-year-old boy make his way down the street, stopping at a tailor's shop, then a grocery, each conversation ending the same way: a shake of the head, a slight drop of the shoulders, and the boy moving on to try the next door. It didn't take long to read the whole situation. A sick father, a mother taking in laundry to make ends meet, younger siblings who needed feeding. Mustafa rose from his table and crossed the street with the same warm, unhurried approach that had worked so many times before. Sympathy first, then a name, then the promise that mattered most. A shopkeeper who might need a strong, honest boy for a few hours' work. Tomorrow. Same corner. The boy's whole face changed at the offer, the exhaustion of a long afternoon of rejection lifting for the first time. He came back the next day, trusting completely, the way a boy trusts an adult who has just offered him the one thing he came out looking for. Mustafa and Bouchabe led him toward a supposed storage room near an old flour mill on the edge of the quarter, and instead into a weed-choked lot behind a row of abandoned buildings, where there was no shopkeeper waiting, no work to be had, only silence and the distant, indifferent barking of a dog somewhere out of sight. Here again, the record is grim, and we will not dwell inside it. The boy tried to run. He could not. Both men assaulted him, and Mustafa killed him with a knife. His body was found 2 days later by a group of children playing near the mill, the same age, roughly, as the boy they found, a detail that would haunt the investigating officers more than almost any other in the file. The mother's grief, neighbors later told reporters, could be heard through closed shutters for days. The killing did not slow from there. If anything, the interval between victims began to compress, as though each act was feeding rather than satisfying whatever had taken root in Mustafa since Meknes. A 13-year-old street child, already sleeping rough, already accustomed to strangers offering food in exchange for small favors, was lured with the promise of a hot meal and a bed for the night. They took him to a derelict rooftop overlooking the Medina and beat him to death, his body left in the open among broken tiles and pigeon droppings, the two men no longer troubling themselves to hide their work the way they had with the first victim. It was, investigators would later note with a particular kind of dread, the clear sign yet that the men behind these deaths had stopped fearing discovery almost entirely. A new idea, born at the movies. In early 1976, something shifted in the partnership. Not conscience, never conscience, but ambition, which in Mustafa's case amounted to much the same engine running in a new direction. The two men sat in the back row of the Mamusnia cinema, the same theater, unremarked upon by either of them, where Mustafa had once picked up his very first victim, watching a dubbed American crime film flicker across the screen in front of a half-empty house. In it, a gangster kidnaps a police officer's son, not for ransom in the ordinary, transactional sense, but as leverage, a life held as collateral against the officer's own investigation. The film was, by most accounts, an unremarkable B-picture. For Mustafa, it landed like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was there. He didn't move when the credits rolled, sat through them. In fact, while the rest of the sparse audience filed out around him, his eyes fixed on the blank screen as though the idea forming behind them needed the darkness to finish taking shape. "We can do that," he finally said, once they were alone in the aisle. Bouchabe frowned, still thinking about the film itself rather than whatever calculation had begun turning behind his partner's eyes. "Do what?" Mustafa's smile this time carried none of its usual warmth. It was the expression of a man who had just found a more efficient use for a hunger he'd assumed had no ceiling. "We take a child, a rich child, and we ask for money, not for us, for the child's life." Bouchabe's first instinct, characteristically, was practical rather than moral. The family would run straight to the police. Mustafa shook his head, already 3 steps ahead. Not if they want to see their child again. By the time they reached their safe house that night, walking through streets gone quiet with the late hour, the plan was already alive in specifics rather than outline. They would not repeat the mistake of targeting a poor family whose grief, however real, carried no leverage and no funds worth extracting. This time the target would be chosen from wealth, a household with something worth losing and the means to pay to keep it. Their eyes settled on the 9-year-old son of a well-known textile merchant in Hay al-Andalus, a boy who would appear in this file only as Omar. The ransom figure they settled on, 20,000 dirhams, was substantial enough to change both their lives and modest enough, they calculated, for a prosperous merchant to produce without involving a bank that might ask questions. The trap is set. For weeks, The two men studied Omar the way a hunter studies a trail, patiently, without a single wasted movement that might draw attention. Mustafa watched from across the street, from the shadow of a parked van, from the doorway of a shuttered shop that had gone out of business years before. Never the same vantage point twice in a row, never long enough in one spot to become a face the neighborhood would remember. He learned Omar's walk to school at 7:30, the leather satchel over his shoulder, the polished shoes his father insisted on, the corner where the boy always hesitated a beat before crossing, the small shop where he sometimes stopped to spend a coin on sweets. Bouchabe, meanwhile, held down a cafe table further along the road, nursing a single cup of coffee for hours at a stretch, watching the wider pattern of the street. Who came and went, when the housemaid walked with the boy, and when she didn't, when the father's shop closed for the day. Neither man spoke much during this stage. They didn't need to. They were hunters who had done this enough times to know exactly what the other was thinking. The approach, when it finally came, was staged with the patience of a much longer con than anything they'd run before. Mustafa introduced himself to the boy directly, on the street, as an old business associate of his father's, freshly returned from years working in Fez. A detail specific enough to sound true, vague enough to be unverifiable. Without an awkward conversation, Omar had no reason to start. Over the following days, he returned again and again, always at the same corner, always with a kind word and a small sweet, drawing out details with the unhurried curiosity of a family friend catching up. The household routines, the father's shop, the mother who had died 2 years earlier, the aunt who now ran the home in her place, the housemaid's name, the school schedule. Every detail was banked. Every visit deepened a trust that had no real foundation beneath it at all. Then came the move that finally closed the trap. Mustafa proposed a surprise, a photograph taken in a studio nearby, as a gift for Omar's father, something to show he'd been thinking of him all these years away. Omar hesitated, said he ought to ask his aunt first. The first small flicker of caution the weeks of grooming hadn't quite managed to erase. But Mustafa's reassurance was practiced and easy. It would only take a few minutes. They'd be back before anyone even noticed he was gone. And it was enough. They walked together into the Medina's narrower streets, Bouchabe trailing a careful distance behind, until they reached a crack-signed studio where an elderly photographer, his hands stained yellow from years of developing chemicals, took the boy's photograph without asking a single question that might have complicated things. Afterward, Mustafa did not take the boy home. "There's one more thing I want to show you," he said, his voice carrying the same easy warmth it always had, and led him deeper into streets that grew narrower and less familiar with every turn, until Omar, sensing for the first time that something about the afternoon had shifted, asked quietly to go home. Mustafa's smile disappeared the moment the request left the boy's mouth. In a dead-end passage walled in on every side, he crouched down to Omar's eye level and delivered, in a handful of flat, unhurried sentences, the truth that ended whatever remained of the boy's childhood. He was not a friend of the family. He would not be going home, and he would not scream. 3 days of silence. They held Omar in a windowless room near the old tanneries, bound, frightened, unharmed physically, because the two men understood something that made the whole scheme work. Fear alone was doing everything they needed it to do. A frightened child, isolated and uncertain, requires no chains beyond the ones already forming in his own mind. That evening, by candlelight, Mustafa sat at a small desk in the corner of the room and wrote the ransom note in slow, careful Arabic script, choosing his words with the same deliberation he'd once used to plan a robbery. Your son is with us. Do not go to the police. Prepare 20,000 dirhams. If you fail, you will find your son's body in the street. He folded it, sealed it, and handed it to Bouchabe with brief instructions. Slide it beneath the gate. Do not be seen. Bouchabe slipped out into the dark and did exactly that. The house on the corner with the blue shutters, belonging to a respected merchant the neighborhood knew as Hajj Abdelkader, a man whose word had always carried weight in the textile markets, fell into a private siege that no outsider would have detected from the street. The shutters stayed closed. The shop remained shut. An unusual absence, the neighbors were told, was due to relatives visiting from Rabat. The housemaid was sent home, so there would be one fewer set of eyes in the house. Abdelkader barely ate, barely slept, sitting for hours by a telephone that refused to ring, 20,000 dirhams already withdrawn from the bank and hidden in a leather case beneath his bed. Every hour of silence was its own kind of torment. No confirmation his son was even still alive. No way to know if the money he'd prepared would matter at all. Only the terrible arithmetic of waiting. When the call finally came, on the third day, the voice on the other end was calm, almost businesslike, discussing the terms of his son's life the way a man might discuss the terms of a shipment. Proof of life, the voice explained, would cost 5,000 dirhams first, a kind of down payment on hope, to be left inside a hollow space in an old wall behind a public fountain in Derb Sultan that same night at 9. Abdelkader made the drop exactly as instructed, walking home afterward with his heart hammering, refusing to look back, never once seeing the shadow that detached itself from a darkened doorway across the street and slipped forward the moment he was gone. It was Bouchabe, collecting the down payment on a life that had already, in every way that mattered to the two men holding it, become a transaction. A photograph followed within days, delivered through a printing shop in the old Medina, where a shopkeeper handed it over without asking a single question that might have complicated things. Omar, stiff and pale, seated before a painted garden backdrop, his hands folded, his face carrying none of the ease it once had. There was no smile in the photograph, but it was undeniably him. Proof he was alive. Proof, and this was the part that cut deepest, Abdelkader would later say, that his son's life now had a market price, and that price was being managed by men who felt nothing while setting it. New Year's Eve, 1976. Word travels even through fear-sealed houses, no matter how carefully a family tries to contain it. Abdelkader had quietly reached out to a well-placed cousin working in the local administration, hoping for guidance without triggering the police response the kidnappers had explicitly threatened against. And in a city as densely networked as Casablanca's poorer quarters, that kind of quiet inquiry rarely stays contained for long. The whisper networks of the underworld have begun to stir, not out of any loyalty to the merchant's family, but because two men circling the household of a known wealthy man was the kind of detail that eventually reaches the right ears. An informant, The sort of small-time operator who survives by knowing things before anyone else does, recognized the description being passed around and filed it away, a coin held back for the right moment to spend. The final exchange was set for December 31st at the old bus station in Bab Marrakesh, and it would prove to be, through nothing but bad luck on the kidnapper's part, the single worst night of the year to move through the city unnoticed. Casablanca on New Year's Eve was a city with its guard fully up, firecrackers cracking down every alley, radios blaring competing songs from open windows, streets packed with revelers moving between bars and family gatherings. The police were out in force, not for any reason connected to Omar, but because the holiday reliably brought its own chaos. Drunk fights, small fires, the general disorder of a city letting off steam all at once. Checkpoints dotted the main roads. Patrols threaded through the crowds. It was, in short, exactly the wrong night for two wanted fugitives to be carrying an illegal firearm through a crowded public space. Mustafa, waiting for Bouchabe at a bar near the station and drinking more than his nerves could really afford, spotted two uniformed officers working their way through the crowd, eyes scanning routinely rather than searching for him specifically. But in a city on New Year's edge, a lone man reeking of alcohol with something heavy weighing down his coat was more than enough to draw a second look. He rose from his stool too fast. The officers noticed the movement and changed direction toward him. He turned to run, but the crowd was too dense, the noise too disorienting, and he stumbled hard into a parked car before recovering his footing. The officers were shouting now, blowing whistles that cut through the surrounding din. A hand caught his coat, another closed around his arm. He fought back, swinging wildly, but the alcohol had slowed his reflexes and the packed street had already closed off every direction he might have run. The pistol slipped loose and rang against the cobblestones, and once the officers saw it, whatever ambiguity remained about the night's arrest evaporated instantly. They drove him to the ground, a knee in his back, the cuffs clicking shut around wrists that had strangled children and bludgeoned a police officer to death without a single tremor. Across the crowd, at the very edge of the chaos, Bouchabe watched his partner go down through a forest of unfamiliar legs and shifting bodies. He did not move to help. He turned, and within seconds, he had vanished entirely into the New Year's Eve crowd, gone for the moment, and leaving Mustafa alone to face what came next. The mask comes off, booked as an ordinary New Year's arrest. An illegal firearm, a false name, no papers. Mustafa spent the night in a holding cell that smelled of disinfectant and old smoke. He should have simply been processed and released in the morning. Instead, a veteran officer named Inspector Ben Ali noticed something in his stillness that didn't sit right and flagged the fingerprints for a morning check. The match came back within hours. Mustafa El-Mestari, already convicted in absentia and under sentence of death for the killing in Meknes. The station moved from routine to emergency in a matter of minutes. The drunk in the holding cell was the man the press had already started calling the smiling killer. The interrogation stretched 3 days. Mustafa denied everything at first. The gun wasn't his, the fingerprints were wrong. He'd only just arrived in the city. But the evidence built around him like rising water. Survivors who remembered his face, a girl who identified him from a photograph without hesitation. That is him. That is the man with the smile. When detectives told him, falsely, that Boucher was already in custody and talking, something in Mustafa's composure finally split. "Boucher is a coward," he said. "I will tell you everything." And he did, in a flat, procedural voice, as though reciting a list of errands rather than confessing to the worst crimes the city's detectives had ever documented. The thefts, more than 400 of them stretching back years. The murdered officer in Meknes, the pipe, the fog. Every killing, every victim, every location, laid out with a precision that seemed almost professional, delivered without a single crack of remorse or a moment's hesitation. The detectives in the room, hardened men who had sat across from murderers before, found themselves unsettled by something they couldn't quite name. Not the content of the confession itself, horrific as it was, but the total absence of anything human in the way it was being given. While Mustafa talked, the city outside had already begun absorbing the news that the smiling killer was in custody, and the reaction moved through the streets like a change in weather. Relief tangled together with a rage that had nowhere yet to go. Boucher, meanwhile, had gone fully to ground. He had watched the arrest from the edge of the New Year's crowd and understood immediately what it meant. And for several days he moved only at night, sleeping in a cheap rented room in the old Medina, venturing out just long enough to buy bread and cigarettes before vanishing again. But Casablanca's informant network, so effective at keeping two wanted men hidden for years, turned with equal efficiency once the incentive shifted. A boy who had once run small errands for Boucher mentioned, in passing, to a friend that he'd spotted him near the tanneries. The friend mentioned it to a market guard. The guard mentioned it to a policeman. Within hours, the building was surrounded, and Boucher, his clothes torn, his face wild with the particular exhaustion of a man who has run out of places to run, was found hiding in a crawl space beneath a stairwell. He did not resist. There was by that point nothing left in him to resist with. The two men were brought face to face for the first time since the arrest, in a corridor of the same station, under the eyes of officers who watched the exchange with an interest that went beyond professional curiosity. Boucher's eyes were hollow, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look years older than he was. Mustafa regarded him with something close to contempt. "You told them everything," he said quietly. Boucher shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told them nothing." Whether that was true or not scarcely mattered anymore. The confession was already on record, in Mustafa's own words, and the physical evidence that would corroborate every detail of it was about to be pulled out of the ground. The well in Sidi Massoud, on January 3rd, 1978, police led both men, cuffed and under heavy guard, to an abandoned cistern in Sidi Massoud beneath a gray, low sky that seemed to press down on the whole quarter. Word of what was about to happen had already spread through the neighborhood, and a crowd gathered beyond the police tape well before the digging began. Women in headscarves standing in silence, old men leaning on canes, mothers holding their own children close, as if proximity alone might offer some kind of protection from what the ground was about to reveal. Through the long, grim afternoon, forensic teams worked the excavation methodically, each find logged, photographed, and lifted with the same careful procedure regardless of how small it was. Small bones, a fragment of skull, a child's sandal, caked in dried mud, small enough to fit in a single cupped hand. Each discovery pulled a fresh sound from the crowd. Not screams, but something lower and more sustained, a collective moan that seemed to rise up out of the earth itself rather than out of any individual throat. Officers who had worked homicide for years later admitted, off the record, that nothing in their careers had prepared them for the particular weight of that afternoon. Bouchabe turned away almost immediately, his shoulders shaking, unable or unwilling to watch what was being carried up out of the well he had helped fill. Mustafa did not look away once. He stood in his cuffs and watched every single recovery with an expression the officers present described, in their reports, as unreadable. Not grief, not horror, nothing that resembled the reaction of a man confronting the physical remains of what he'd done. For the city of Casablanca, watching this scene ripple outward through newspaper reports and word of mouth in the days that followed, that stillness would become almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Trial and sentence. The trial opened in February 1978, and the courtroom in Casablanca filled well past its intended capacity, the public gallery overflowing, journalists for both the national and international press wedged into every available corner, hallway, and doorway outside. The two defendants sat behind a metal grill that separated them from the rest of the room, their faces etched in the shadow cast by the courtroom's harsh overhead lighting. The charges, when they were finally read aloud, took several minutes to get through. Aggravated theft spanning years, kidnapping, extortion, aggravated assault, and multiple counts of the premeditated murder of minors. In the front row, the families of the victims sat with their hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white, listening to details many of them had never been told in full. One mother fainted outright when the prosecutor described her son's wounds in the clinical language the case required. Another let out a scream that cut straight through the courtroom's tense silence and echoed off the high ceiling. The judge called repeatedly for order, his own voice cracking under the strain of presiding over a case that had already consumed the entire country's attention. Over the following days, the prosecution built its case methodically. The confession, the forensic evidence from the well, the surviving witnesses who took the stand to describe encounters that had haunted them for years, the girl who had once lost her grandmother's bracelets and now stood, grown, pointing across the courtroom at the man who had taken them. Each testimony added another layer to a picture the country had struggled to fully absorb. Not an isolated act of violence, but a sustained campaign that had unfolded in plain sight for the better part of a decade. When Mustafa was finally called to speak in his own defense, he rose slowly, his chains clinking against the floor in the courtroom's absolute silence. He offered no apology, no plea for mercy. What he offered instead was his childhood, the hunger, the cold, the poverty that had shaped him, framed not as an excuse, but as an explanation, delivered in the same flat, unbothered tone he'd used throughout the confession. "I never meant to kill anyone," he said, his voice remarkably steady for a man facing a nearly certain death sentence. "The circumstances made me do it. I only wanted money. The rest was just necessary. The prosecutor did not bother masking his contempt in his closing remarks, turning from the defendant to address the judge directly. A confession to crimes that defied comprehension, offered without a shred of genuine remorse, admitted no explanation any functioning society could accept as mitigation. The only just verdict, he argued, was death. The courtroom fell utterly silent as the judge announced the court would retire to deliberate. The deliberation stretched across 2 full days, an eternity for the families waiting outside the courtroom doors. On February 23, 1978, the court reconvened, and the judge's voice, though low, carried to every corner of the packed room. Mustafa El-Mestari and Boucheb Azzouzi were found guilty on every single count, sentenced to death by firing squad, the execution to be carried out in 1982. As the verdict landed, Boucheb's body folded, collapsing like something with the structure suddenly removed from it. Mustafa remained standing, his face giving away nothing, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the courtroom wall that only he seemed able to see. The victims' families wept openly, some in grief that had finally found somewhere to land, others in something closer to relief. Outside, in the streets surrounding the courthouse, the gathered crowd released a sound that was neither triumph nor mourning, but some uneasy mixture of both. The smiling killer, whatever else awaited him, would never smile at another child again. Dawn, 1982. The sentence, when it finally came, marked more than the end of one man's life. It would become one of the final chapters in an era of Moroccan capital punishment that was, without anyone fully realizing it at the time, drawing to a close. The execution took place in a prison courtyard on the outskirts of the city, the sky above pale and indifferent, the ground still wet from overnight rain that had done nothing to wash away the tension hanging over the yard. 12 riflemen stood in formation, arranged according to a tradition meant to soften the psychological burden of the act itself. 6 of the rifles loaded with live rounds, 6 with blanks, and no man among them told which was which. A small, deliberate mercy extended to the executioners, if not to the men they were about to kill. Mustafa stood straight against the whitewashed wall, silent, his lips moving in something that might have been a final prayer, or might have been a last, bitter curse directed at whatever had made him what he was. He did not beg. He did not call out for anyone. Beside him, Boucheb was barely able to remain upright. His legs had given out twice already on the walk across the courtyard, and the guards had been forced to half carry, half drag him the final stretch, his blindfold soaked through with tears, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps that were audible even from a distance. The commander raised his hand. The rifles came up in unison. For one long, terrible second, the courtyard held nothing but silence and the distant cry of a single seagull circling somewhere over the Atlantic. Then the order came, and the crack of the rifles broke the stillness all at once, echoing hard off the whitewashed walls. Both men went down together, Mustafa falling forward and then sideways in a single motion, Boucheb sagging against the wall and sliding to the ground beside him. The commander crossed the yard, checked for any remaining sign of life, and signaled the medical officer forward to confirm what was already clear. It was over. The prison log recorded the date simply as 1982. The time is dawn. The last full entry in a file that had taken the better part of a decade and the lives of at least half a dozen children to close. Mustafa El-Mestari and Bouche Bazouzi were among the last men executed in Morocco before the practice fell into disuse, their deaths marking, without either of them intending it, a quiet turning point in the country's relationship with the death penalty itself. What remains? How does a man become Mustafa El-Mestari? The court heard the argument. Poverty, hunger, a childhood with no tenderness in it, and sentenced him to death regardless. Because poverty explains nothing on its own. Most children who grow up hungry in a crowded slum do not become predators. The line between surviving hardship and preying on the innocent is crossed by choice, over and over, with full knowledge of what's being done. Mustafa made that choice every time. The families never fully recovered. Some still live in the old neighborhoods. Many left, unable to bear the streets their children once walked home along. The well in Sidi Masood was sealed in concrete, but local children still steer around that corner after dark, and their mothers still lower their voices when the story comes up. The Mamusnia cinema is gone now, replaced by shops and apartments. But the old city remembers the boy who once waited there for a friend who never came, and left instead with two smiling strangers. This case pushed Morocco toward a broader reckoning, with capital punishment, with the protection of children, with the gaps between police jurisdictions that had let two men vanish from city to city for years. Mustafa and Bouche were among the last executions the kingdom carried out. The death penalty remains on the books today, but has not been applied since. That is not redemption. It is simply a fact left behind by two men who left far worse ones in their wake. The surviving girl from that very first robbery, the bracelets, the wrist, the smile, grew up carrying the memory long after gold jewelry stopped being something she could wear. She told a journalist, years later, that she still dreams of the man in the clean shirt asking for her name. The smiling killer's smile outlived the kill. If you found this case compelling, hit the like button, subscribe, and share your theories in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next case.